Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On April 11th, 2026, the 75th anniversary of President Truman's relief of General Douglas MacArthur, the MacArthur Memorial hosted a half-day symposium to explore this event from the perspectives of both Truman and MacArthur. This symposium featured scholars from the MacArthur Memorial, the Truman Presidential Library and Museum, and Old Dominion University. This event was sponsored by the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. A recording of the full program is on the MacArthur Memorial's YouTube channel. The following episode features a presentation by Dr. Tim Orr, Associate Professor of History at Old Dominion University.
Our final presenter today is Dr. Timothy Orr, Associate Professor of History at Old Dominion University. He is the co-author of the national bestseller, Never Call Me a Hero, a legendary American dive bomber pilot remembers the Battle of Midway. And he's currently working on a new book project about a U.S. Navy dive bomber pilot in the Pacific War. Dr. Orr's focus is American military history, and like our first two presenters, he plays an important role in supporting and teaching students throughout the year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Orr.
Thank you very much for having me. So in 1962, writer Merle Miller conducted a series of oral history interviews with former President Harry Truman that were eventually published in a 1973 biography, long after Truman and MacArthur had died. During these interviews, Truman spoke about his controversial decision to sack General MacArthur in April 1951. Truman's explanation is pithy, and it is worth reading aloud. Now, to preface, a few scholars have suggested that this particular passage might have been fabricated, because in fact, Merle Miller is the source for this apocryphal story of the two men circling Wake Island, waiting for each other to land, and that's why people have questioned it. But I do find this particular quote in line with Truman's brash style of conversation, and in line with his contemporaneous reasons for firing MacArthur. So upon being asked, Truman said this: "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. That's the answer to that. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the laws for generals. If it was, half to three-quarters of them would be in jail. I've given it a lot of thought, and I've finally decided that there were times when he wasn't right in the head. And there was never anyone around to keep him in line. He didn't have anyone on his staff who wasn't an ass-kisser," unquote. For my own opinion, I think President Truman was incorrect on a few points. First of all, MacArthur was not a dumb SOB. Second of all, although America has produced a great number of generals who were dumb SOBs, to say that three-quarters of them met that criteria seems excessive. Third of all, MacArthur was a fairly clear-headed fellow. And fourth of all, although his staff did have its share of shameless admirers, they were not by any means all that way. But it is that first thing that Truman said upon which I would like to focus. When asked about his reason for the firing, Truman laid it out in one sentence: he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. It is a well-known fixture of American military history to say that one of its hallmarks is that it runs on the principle of civilian control of the military. So for Truman to make the accusation that MacArthur would not respect the authority of the president implies that MacArthur had committed a mortal sin that runs contrary to the essence of the American military establishment. Now, my primary objective today is not to tell you whether or not I believe that MacArthur committed that sin, though I will share my opinion on that nonetheless. It is instead my objective to argue that MacArthur sits at the end of a long line of confrontations between civil and military authorities. MacArthur was hardly the first general to be accused of disrespecting a president's powers as commander-in-chief. By comparison, the words he uttered were far less inflammatory than those of his predecessors, far less troublesome to the sitting president, and far less likely to lead to a military coup. But those words from 1951 were sufficiently problematic to be considered over the line for acceptable behavior. And I contend that this was the result of 175 years of persistent conflict between American presidents and their senior generals over which of the two had the right to make the key command decisions that shaped the path of history. It might be said then that MacArthur was not so much a victim of his own ego, or even the victim of the ego of Harry Truman, but the victim of history itself. Now, Americans' distrust of their own military did not arise as a phenomenon unique to democracy. Instead, it was inherited from British politics, a capstone concept offered by the Whigs, the political party that opposed absolutist monarchy. During the years of the colonial crisis, British Americans drank in the ideas of radical pamphleteers, Thomas Gordon, John Trenchard, Algernon Sidney, and a host of other names that are now forgotten by the average American. And they came to the conclusion that standing armies were antithetical to the notions of liberty. Now, for example, Oliver Noble, a minister from Newburyport, Massachusetts, who had access to these Whiggish pamphlets, used what he learned from them to foment rebellion in the colony. On March the 5th, 1775, the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, Noble delivered a harangue from his pulpit, chiding the sentiments of all wise men, the patriots of every country, the experience of all ages bear testimony against a standing army, as inconsistent with liberty, whenever there exists a power in the free state to trample upon or control its laws, that state is no longer free. It does not strain much imagination to imagine that some of the men who were attending his sermon perhaps fought the British a month later at Lexington and Concord. Now, of course, the great irony of the Revolution was that in order to outlast the British, the Continental Congress required a standing army of its own, a substantial force that needed to be fed, uniformed, outfitted, equipped, provisioned, and paid. Throughout the conflict, the Continental Army and the general public were at odds with each other. The Continental Congress lacked the ability to enforce taxation, and it could do little to control the inflation of its own currency. It appealed then to the state governments, but they responded only by looking after their own financial interests. Unwilling to make sacrifices on behalf of those who were fighting, the state governments let the Continental Army nearly starve to death. As a result, George Washington and his officer corps became openly resentful of civilian governments for not making the sacrifices necessary to sustain the army in the field. The situation became so strained that, in March 1782, as the Revolutionary War finally neared its conclusion, the Continental Army's officer corps staged a near coup d'etat, a scheme to march on the national capital, acquire post-war pensions through brute force, and possibly install a military dictator in place of the newly created Confederation Congress. Known today as the Newburgh Conspiracy, this plan was foiled in embryo by George Washington himself, who advised his officers to lay aside their grievances by asserting that the pride of having fought well should be reward enough. Washington's words are often quoted, but less attention has been paid to the language of the Newburgh grievances, which well encapsulated the disgust that soldiers felt against civilians for quite literally leaving them out in the cold. Can you, read the grievances, then consent to be the only sufferers by this revolution, and retiring from the field, grow old in poverty, wretchedness, and contempt? Can you consent to wade through the vile mire of dependency and owe the miserable remnant of that life to charity, which has hitherto been spent in honor? If you can, go, and carry with you the jest of Tories and the scorn of Whigs, the ridicule, and what is worse, the pity of the world. Go starve and be forgotten. But if your spirit should revolt at this, if you have sense enough to discover, and spirit enough to oppose tyranny under whatever garb it may assume, whether it be the plain coat of republicanism or the splendid robe of royalty, if you have yet learned to discriminate between a people and a cause, between men and principles, awake, attend to your situation and redress yourselves. If the present moment be lost, every future effort is in vain, and your threats then will be as empty as your entreaties now. Now, from this tension arose America's need to put constraints on its standing army. Upon drafting the Constitution, the framers made certain that all service personnel would swear an oath of allegiance, a vow to preserve, protect, and defend the country and its government, with practice as well as words. That oath requires all uniformed personnel, from the lowest private to the highest general, to accept the fundamental principle of civilian control of the military. Now, since the ratification of the Constitution, that principle has been put to the test. Early on, generals clashed with civilian authority due to ambitions that arose from threats to their reputation. Brigadier General James Wilkinson, who you can see on the slide here, was Thomas Jefferson's senior general, and he became the first serious problem. In 1806, General Wilkinson had gone to Louisiana Territory to assist in the quashing of the Burr conspiracy, a plot that was crafted by none other than the former Vice President Aaron Burr to manufacture a war with Spain that might cause Louisiana to secede from the United States. Now, Wilkinson's operations prevented war and they prevented secession, but in the course of carrying out his duties, he declared martial law over the refusal of the territorial governor, seemingly to arrest witnesses who might have testified to the general's early complicity in the very conspiracy he was sent out to quash. These moves displeased Jefferson, and they enraged Congressman John Randolph, the other image you can see on the slide, who interpreted Wilkinson's moves as abuse of power. During the subsequent trial for the Burr conspirators, Randolph, who was acting as prosecutor, kept Wilkinson on the witness stand for 4 days in a vain attempt to get the general to perjure himself. Randolph declared, "I would teach the military that they are to be subordinate to the civil power, and that if they are to undertake to violate the civil institutions of their country, they should pay the penalty of their lives. If you do not guard the people from such an excess of military power, the time will come when you will be kicked out at the point of the bayonet." Now, it was not always generals who took counsel of their ambition, but presidents as well. 40 years later, during the Mexican-American War, President James K. Polk became fearful when one of his generals, Zachary Taylor, won too many victories in northern Mexico. General Taylor was a Whig and Polk was a Democrat, and the president feared, and rightfully so, that Taylor would use his military fame for a presidential bid in 1848. To prevent Taylor from making any further advance into Mexico and winning additional glory, Polk reassigned 4 of Taylor's divisions to a different general, hoping that the reduction in troop numbers would convince him to stay put. The move, by the way, nearly spelled disaster for the U.S. Army because the Mexican Army made an unpredictable 200-mile march north across the desert to engage Taylor's forces at the Battle of Buena Vista. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, the Americans won the day. Now, the most serious confrontation between a president and his generals happened during the American Civil War. When that confrontation broke out, West Point-trained generals often found themselves at cross purposes to Abraham Lincoln's administration. West Pointers, who tended to belong to the Democratic Party, approached the war in a conservative manner. They advised tactics that focused on entrenching and maneuverability. They wanted to limit the war's destructiveness and to prevent Confederate territory from being reorganized and Confederate leaders prosecuted for treason. Also, they wanted Union victory to restore the Union to status quo antebellum, the Union as it was, with slavery left untouched. Meanwhile, Lincoln and his cabinet thought the exact opposite. They believed that U.S. generals needed to be more aggressive, to attack the enemy more relentlessly. They believed that Confederate civilians needed to feel the burdens of the war by having their property confiscated, their borders remade, and their citizenship imperiled. And most importantly, by 1862, they believed that the war effort needed to include emancipation. Reunion could not occur until the Confederate rebellion accepted the extinction of slavery. Union generals, particularly those from West Point, struggled to subordinate their training to the political wishes with which they disagreed. Colonel Eugene Cosley, pictured here, claimed that the generals in his division all planned to resign if the president or Congress enacted emancipation. Cosley claimed that he would do the same. He wrote, "If Congress, the president, or their fanatical abolitionist generals will institute measures for the emancipation of the slaves against the wishes of the majority, then I will myself withdraw from the field. I came here to reestablish the Union as it was, but not to robe and subjugate any people. Let the South be paid as they deserve for their folly. Let every man die who works to destroy this land of liberty, but never steal their property, as the abolitionists desire to do with the Southern men. Not every general could endure the policy of emancipation, and some did indeed tender their resignation. Some left the army gracefully, but many others did not, and they had to be forced out by the Lincoln administration because of their resistance to emancipation. One of the most illustrative cases involved Colonel Frank Wolford, you can see here, commander of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry. In March 1864, his men gifted him a new presentation sword. In the acceptance speech, Wolford openly criticized the president's policy of recruiting black men into the Union Army. He delivered several other speeches criticizing the government until 3 months later, when a Republican general ordered Wolford arrested for delivering seditious remarks. Now, before a court-martial could be convened, Lincoln stepped in, offering to release Wolford from arrest and award him with an honorable discharge, but only if Wolford promised not to say or do anything that might hinder the recruitment of African American troops in the future. Upon being offered this deal, Wolford lost his cool. He fired off an angry letter that accused the president of being a tyrant, of holding him in confinement to score political points to ensure his reelection, and declaring his willingness to die on a gibbet before accepting the legality of his arrest. In a prediction that did not hold true, Wolford said this: "Impartial history, in attesting the goodness and severity of God, will write you down as the greatest tyrant that ever lived." Now, Wolford's anger was a bit abnormal, but he was hardly the only U.S. officer to use his rank to advance his political aims. Throughout the war, Union officers used their positions to foment political interference, and both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, engaged in this type of behavior. In one instance, in November 1862, Major General Carl Schurz, a Republican, admonished President Lincoln for appointing too many Democrats to the rank of general. Problematically, most West Point trained officers were Democrats, but Schurz believed that it would be better for the Union to have untrained officers than generals who disregarded the president's will to enforce emancipation. Schurz wrote, "If West Point cannot do the business, let West Point fail. Who cares? It is better that 1,000 generals should fall than that the Republic should be jeopardized a single moment." Lincoln, by the way, did not heed Schurz's advice, and he replied to him by saying that he would continue to appoint capable officers even if they came from the rival political party. Perhaps more startling, Union generals put pressure on their own troops to vote the way they wanted. The Civil War was something of a revolutionary moment for voting because it was the first time in American history that hundreds of thousands of Americans voted from afar, having their ballots or the results of their in-camp elections mailed home to be included in the local polls. In 1864, a Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh arrived at the Army of the Potomac's encampment to distribute Republican ballots to the soldiers. A Democratic officer, Colonel Jacob Schweitzer, became so incensed at the minister's success that he challenged him to a fistfight, vowing to, quote, thrash the life out of him for his unpatriotic utterances of those belonging to the Democratic faith. In August 1864, a soldier in the 179th New York, a Democrat, wrote an inflammatory letter to his local newspaper, encouraging voters on the home front to vote against the Lincoln government in the upcoming presidential election. That same letter, by happenstance, criticized the Army of the Potomac's commander, George Meade, calling him, quote, the most complete military charlatan that has ever worn a major general's stars. Meade, furious upon learning what the letter had said, insisted upon a court-martial, even charging the defendant with the 57th Article of War, which, if found guilty, would have resulted in the death penalty. Now, happily for the soldier in question, Private Newton Spencer, the court found him not guilty of the capital crime. But it did find him guilty of lesser offenses, forcing him to forfeit 6 months of pay. But he was returned to active duty. The controversy did not end there, however, because a Republican general who owed his commission to Lincoln's good graces appealed to the War Department to overturn the verdict. But after months of correspondence, Lincoln refused to intervene. Newspaper reporters, too, could become victims, and they faced humiliating treatment when they earned the ire of generals. The very same officer whom Private Spencer had insulted, Major General Meade, became livid when a Cincinnati reporter embedded in the Army, a man named Edward Cropsey, whom Meade intentionally called Crapsey, affronted Meade's incompetence in an editorial published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Losing his temper, Meade refused to give Cropsey any additional access to the Army of the Potomac's bivouac. Meade ordered Cropsey mounted backwards on a mule and forced him to wear a placard that read, "Libeler of the Press," before having an armed guard parade him through the camp so that thousands of Union soldiers could jeer at him. But beyond silencing the media, attempting to control elections, threatening dissenters, flouting presidential authority, and attempting to delay the promotion of other officers, some Union generals indulged in the most sinister of all anti-democratic ideas, replacing the office of the president with a military dictator. Now, the character who indulged these fantasies the most was Major General George McClellan, the vainglorious first commander of the Army of the Potomac. His feud with President Lincoln has become legendary among Civil War enthusiasts, and his desire to suggest a dictatorship is made fully evident in his private letters to his wife, in which he held contempt for the civilians who directed the Army and Navy. Writing to his wife, McClellan groused, "I cannot tell you how disgusted I am becoming with these wretched politicians. They are a most despicable set of men, and I think Secretary of State Seward is the meanest of them all. A meddling, officious, incompetent little puppy. He has done more than any other one man to bring all this misery upon the country, and is one of the least competent to get us out of the scrape. The President is nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. Secretary of the Navy Wells is weaker than the most garrulous old woman you were ever annoyed by." And then, as if to add this, as if he needed to tell his wife this, "Only keep these complimentary opinions to yourself, or you may get me into premature trouble." Now, McClellan spoke of dictatorship in these letters to his wife, apparently driven by his derisive attitude towards the administration, but also by his own high opinion of himself. But he also mentioned that, if the opportunity came, he would turn down the dictatorship, or rather claimed he would relinquish the dictatorship when the war ended. This is what that particular letter said. "I will never accept the presidency, but I will cheerfully take the dictatorship and agree to lay down my life when my country is saved. I am not spoiled by my unexpected and new position. I feel sure that God will give me strength and wisdom to preserve this great nation." Now, Lincoln knew about these dictatorship rumors, as did a great many generals who supported him. Lincoln never confronted McClellan about it, but he did famously chide another Army commander, Major General Joseph Hooker, who seemed to have the same idea in his head. Before appointing Hooker to Army command in January 1863, Lincoln put him on notice. "I have heard," Lincoln wrote, in such a way as to believe it, "of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." Now, this is a funny line, very typical for Lincoln's style of comedy, but what then followed was a more serious admonition, one that explained to Hooker why such complaints about the government and about previous Army commanders would, in the long term, hinder the war effort. Lincoln continued, "The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse the Army of the habit of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it." Now, it is no surprise, then, that in the aftermath of the Civil War, prejudice against professional generals persevered. The behaviors of the anti-Lincoln generals had been so aggravating, even borderline seditious, that the U.S. government sought to restrict their influence in public life. In the post-Civil War years, the Commandant of Cadets of West Point, Colonel Emory Upton, drew heavy fire from politicians merely because he dared to suggest that the United States should spend its fortune on developing a standing army and rely less and less upon citizen soldiers, the U.S. volunteers, and the state militia. When Upton attempted to publish a book on that subject in 1874, Illinois Senator John A. Logan campaigned to suppress Upton's writing, accusing him of aspiring to create an anti-democratic military elite. This underlying fear of a standing army lasted into the interwar years. For instance, Colonel John Macaulay Palmer testified before Congress during the hearings that were meant to create the National Defense Act of 1920. Palmer, who was a dyed-in-the-wool West Pointer, advised a peacetime army to be made of citizen soldiers. He declared, if American citizen armies, extemporized after the outbreak of war, could do as well as Washington's Continentals and as well as the citizen armies of Grant and Lee, what might they do if organized and trained in times of peace? Now, the answer to Palmer's rhetorical question was obvious to those who sympathized with his opinion. Professional armies, if left to their own devices, would cause mischief for American democracy. And there was no shortage of generals or admirals who caused mischief. Too often, they refused advice from politicians if they did not mesh with their worldview. Franklin Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy as well as Commander-in-Chief, hated the continued resistance he faced from admirals who opposed his effort to modernize the fleet. In 1940, Roosevelt wrote to a friend. He said, "The admirals are really something to cope with, and I should know. To change anything in the Navy is like punching a feather bed. You punch it with your right hand, and you punch it with your left hand until you are finally exhausted, and then you find the damn bed just as it was before you started punching." Now, some of these disputes could be exhausting. In 1925, the nation was captivated by the saga of the court-martial of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, Deputy Chief of the U.S. Army Air Service. For years, Mitchell had been demanding the creation of a separate, independent Air Force, and to make his case, he had been interfering in Navy ordnance tests to prove that airplanes could sink battleships. Eventually, Mitchell published his findings, which included privileged information, in a controversial book entitled Winged Defense. And to top it off, he made wild accusations accusing certain admirals of treason due to their mismanagement of the Navy's aviation branch. An emotionally unstable man, Mitchell demanded his day in court, and the U.S. Army obliged him by charging him with the 96 Article of War, that is, acting prejudicial to good order. After a 7-week trial that called 41 witnesses, the court found Mitchell guilty as charged. Mitchell's peers could see his posturing for what it was, a narcissistic attempt to create an independent command for himself. And as an aside, it should be noted that one of the major generals who sat on that court that found Mitchell guilty was Major General Douglas MacArthur. Now, the Second World War changed all of this. More than any other conflict, that war altered America's public consciousness about the dangers of having a standing army and navy. The need to develop a multinational alliance that engaged in coalition warfare required American generals to become much more involved in social and political affairs. Senior generals and the president's chiefs of staff ended up creating foreign policy, and their decisions vitally shaped the contours of post-war reconstruction in Europe and Asia. Now, as the nation geared up to fight the Cold War, or potentially a Third World War against the Soviet Empire, American generals and admirals sat at the pinnacle of international esteem. They had become men almost universally credited with restoring the world order. And that leads us to the Truman-MacArthur controversy, when the decision to relieve MacArthur of his duties turned on the question of whether his behavior had violated the sacred principle of civilian control. MacArthur called for air attacks on China, which Truman rejected. When Truman denied his request, MacArthur went to the public, implying that Truman was practicing appeasement. MacArthur didn't speak directly to the American people. Instead, he wrote a letter to the congressional minority leader, a Republican, Joseph W. Martin, who's now been pictured 3 times today. Hopefully you walk away with memory of what he looks like. In turn, Martin read a portion of MacArthur's letter on the floor of Congress. Scathingly, that letter criticized Truman's policy. It said, "If we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. Win it, and Europe most probably would avoid war and preserve freedom. As you point out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory." Now, from Truman's perspective, MacArthur's letter to Congressman Martin constituted the breach of protocol that obligated him to relieve the general of his command. Truman ordered his removal, and on April the 11th, 1951, he addressed the nation. And this is what the president said. "We do not want to see the war in Korea extended. We are trying to prevent a world war, not start one. The best way to do that is to make it plain that we and the other free countries will continue to resist attack. But you may ask, why can't we take other steps to punish the aggressor? Why don't we bomb Manchuria and China itself? Why don't we assist Chinese nationalist troops to land on the mainland of China? If we were to do these things, we would be running a very grave risk of starting a general war. If that were to happen, we would have brought about the exact situation we are trying to prevent. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real aim of our policy. It was with deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is far more important than any individual. Now, trust, in my opinion, is supposed to go both ways. But it would seem that, in this case, the trust was one-sided. Truman was willing to trust MacArthur's competence as a general, but MacArthur was unwilling to trust the president's right to forge a new policy. Although MacArthur accepted his firing gracefully, I would contend that he left military service without rancor or contempt. In his final message to Congress, delivered on April the 19th, MacArthur made it abundantly clear that he did not support Truman's right to negotiate a peaceful end to the war in Korea. He said this: "Efforts have been made to distort my position. It has been said, in effect, that I was a warmonger. Nothing could be further from the truth. I know war as few other men now living know it, and nothing to me is more revolting. I have long advocated its complete abolition, as its very destructiveness on both friend and foe has rendered it useless as a means of settling international disputes. But the utter destructiveness of war now blots out this alternative. We've had our last chance. If we will not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door." Now, whatever else might be said about MacArthur, I think we need to recognize the sincerity of these words. War in the 20th century had grown more ferocious, more all-encompassing, and more high stakes, to the point that MacArthur could not, in good conscience, remain silent when a president with whom he disagreed put the nation on a perceived path to ruin. But as much as we might sympathize with the humanity of MacArthur, we must also recognize the fact that he violated a cardinal rule. He did not accept the president's right to be wrong. MacArthur often said there is no substitute for victory. I respectfully disagree. In a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, the voters of these United States and the people they place into power always have the right to substitute whatever political resolution they desire, no matter how incorrect it may be, no matter how it may affect the lives of the men and women who serve our nation's armed forces, and no matter how many lives it may cost. For right or wrong, that is the principle upon which civilian control of the military stands. If those decisions end up treating the armed forces unjustly, then the shame should fall squarely upon the voters for selecting incompetent people to serve as commanders-in-chief. Now, in 2002, Dr. Richard H. Cohn, now Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, wrote an essay in which he lamented the increasing efforts of senior generals to frustrate civilian authority. Now, at the time, he was speaking directly to those generals who had treated the Bill Clinton administration with contempt. Cohn used his essay as an opportunity to remind them about their obligations to respect their civilian leaders. Now, a portion of his essay is worth quoting because it could easily be applied to the story of General MacArthur. Cohn said this: "Ponder whether you are prepared to accept, as a principle of civilian control, that it includes the right of civilians to be wrong, to make mistakes, indeed to insist on making mistakes. This may be hard to accept, given that people's lives or the security of the nation hang in the balance. But remember that the military can be wrong, dead wrong about military affairs. After all, you are not politicians. And as Karl von Clausewitz wrote long ago, war is an extension of politics. If the trend toward increasing friction and hostility civil-military relations continues into the future, the national security of the United States will not be well served." Now, when we look back upon the legacy of the relief of General MacArthur, now 75 years removed, we should remember it as a bittersweet moment. A strong case can be made that MacArthur was right, given the persistent international problems and human rights violations caused by the North Korean regime, even to this very day. There can be little doubt that MacArthur's insistence on prosecuting the Korean War to unconditional victory would have led to long-term benefits in both the United States and Asia. But given, America's checkered history between its presidents and its generals, particularly in the 19th century where it was the worst of all, we must also conclude that Truman did the correct thing by relieving MacArthur, because surrendering even an iota of civilian authority would strike at the very heart of our national character. In short, if you take away nothing else from my presentation, know this: Harry Truman might very well have been the real dumb SOB, but Douglas MacArthur was still duty-bound to respect him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Orr. We have some time for questions, and we have another microphone going around.
In line with MacArthur's actions, could you comment on in World War II when General Marshall, Admiral King, and General Arnold all opposed President Roosevelt's insistence on invading North Africa, and they put in writing their opposition to that and sent him a direct letter in writing saying, "We are opposing your policy." And of course, Roosevelt writes back, "You're going to do it," and he signed it the only time commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
So could you just comment on your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on it is I think that Roosevelt probably sympathized with those generals and admirals because the American plan was always to open up a second front in Western Europe, right, in a cross-channel attack in northern France. But I think their hands were tied because in order to do that, they needed the requisite amphibious assault equipment coming from the other allies, particularly Great Britain. And Britain did not want to do that. They wanted to fight in the Mediterranean, and they were pushing the Americans towards North Africa. And there's a really great quote from Eisenhower where he says, you have to understand this international alliance from multiple perspectives, right? And this is we, the Americans, we fight this war based on our own predispositions, right? And for the Americans, it is you got to go into Western Europe first because the last thing you want is to let the Soviet Union come in and liberate Western Europe, because then it's all going to go communist and everyone in America is going to freak out about that. But the British, their perspective is they want to hold on to empire, right? So they're doing whatever they can to make sure the Allied offensives are first directed into places where the Tories in Great Britain can walk away with a political victory. So my answer to that is I would imagine that Roosevelt was sympathetic to what those officers were saying, but in the end, he had other obligations, which is to secure this international alliance, to make sure that Britain and the United States worked in lockstep, because for the early part of that alliance, it was not. So I think that's why he stepped in, and I was unaware of how he signed it, but I imagine that the message was sent, right? We're commander-in-chief. I have bigger problems than your kind of myopic ideas about military strategy. This is about creating an international alliance that may, in the end, be necessary to fight off a third world war against the Soviet Union.
I know this is going to muddy the waters a little bit. The civilian authority, with the president being the commander-in-chief, and the Congress coming to Congress to declare war, muddies the water a little bit about the civilian authority. Can you touch on that? I know that there will be more questions on that in other programs, but it's confusing to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think this was part of the both the successes and the failures of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, right? That you have these 55 delegates who are coming in trying to define what controls there should be over a standing army, right? And, by the 1780s, a lot of the leading members of government in the United States kind of changed their tune on standing armies, right? Because they discovered that there were problems when the United States becomes a nation, right? There is a thing called the Algerian hostage crisis, where American mariners are taken hostage by the Barbary states, and they can't ransom these guys back. There are continued problems against the Shawnee and the Miami out on the frontier, and they can't put down these wars against Native Americans. So they're starting to say, all right, maybe the biggest event of all is called Shays Rebellion, which is a local rebellion that there is no army available initially to go up to Massachusetts and stop what is essentially a coup d'etat by the working class, right? So for all these reasons, now the people who are putting together the U.S. Constitution say there needs to be a standing army, but there's got to be some power to keep it in check. And they put in all those powers into Congress, right? So Congress decides the shape of these armies and navies, how big it is, where they can deploy, and most important, whether a state of war exists. And so the immediate check that the people have upon the armed forces is mostly going to be through the Congress. But then the president is, of course, the person who directs where they go and decides what they do, right? And it's a very interesting separation of powers, right? So it essentially gives the president very vague instructions about his or her role as commander-in-chief. Because that Article 2 says president is commander-in-chief. It doesn't say anything more than that. You can interpret it as wide as you want, right? But then the congressional powers are delineated and they're very specific, right? And so I think the idea behind it was, number one, to give the president freedom to be basically the senior chief of all armed forces personnel. But at the same time, there is this easy way that you can hold those powers in check, right? Because there are congressional elections every 2 years. If you don't like what the president's doing, put in a new set of congresspersons, and if the president is doing military actions, you can just give that president an army of one person, right? And they won't be able to do anything about it. And the other aspect is kind of the human aspect, which is, as the framers were putting together the Constitution, they spent all their time on Article 1 creating the legislature. And then when they got to the presidency, they were all worn out because they were in a room with no air conditioning, smelling each other's BO. So, like, if you look at Article 2, it's much shorter. And when they get to Article 3, the Supreme Court, it's even shorter than that, right? So they just wanted out of there. And the powers of each successive branch of government became more and more vague, right? So I think that kind of explains the interesting dynamic. But so far, 250 years, it's been working for us, right?
So MacArthur is someone that was very concerned about the military-industrial complex, and Eisenhower is very concerned about that later too. Does that add another element to this kind of back and forth between the military and then the political leadership?
I would imagine it does, right? That there is kind of the concern that generals are, I don't know, calling the shots when it comes to the types of American industries that develop. I have to plead ignorance. I'm not so much an expert on this era of history as I would like to be. But I mean, there were some pretty kind of rough encounters. One that I know fairly well is called the Revolt of the Admirals, which was kind of mentioned briefly by one of the other speakers. So in 1949, there was this effort to by the newly created U.S. Air Force to try to take all aviation, right, and bring it under their own branch of service. So they want to steal the Navy's aircraft carriers, they want to steal the Marine air units, and then the Air Force will control everything that is in flight. And it ends up leading to cancellation of a few important Navy ships, including this big supercarrier they're going to create called the USS United States, to build this intercontinental bomber, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. And just how these contracts are awarded leads to congressional hearings. The admirals kind of argue that this one branch of service, the Air Force, is calling the shots too often, right? And it's and they find it kind of appalling that it goes this way. And they think that the problem is the politicians are all the ones focused on air power and dropping bombs from the air, and the Navy folks just want to fight battles like they always fought it, on the sea, right? With ships versus ships. And if you're going to take away our ability to be relevant, then what's the point of having a Navy in general, right? So there is a ton of like political action that develops, but I think in the end, largely what the armed forces get is the kind of branches of service that they want and that they envision, right? I think in the end, they really do call the shots.
No, we talk about the negative. I would argue, if I was in your class, as an example of where the political power of the presidency and the Congress, where it worked, was during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that the Kennedy brothers and their staff, we knew what, for example, we knew what some of the advice was from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how to, hey, let's take this out quickly while we can. And they paused. A lot of luck involved, but yet in turn, if other people were involved, maybe the result would have been very different. But I would argue it worked at that time.
Yeah, and I would argue that the immediate aftermath of the MacArthur firing is that where civilian control is maybe at its strongest and the most confident is during the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson, is reported to have kind of bullied many generals by saying, "Don't pull a MacArthur on me," right? The implication being that I'm the man in charge. And if you buck my policy, then you're going to be fired, right? And you'll be disgraced. And I think that was a thing that a great many generals in the aftermath of Vietnam sort of despised, right? That when that war was over, they felt that civilians had been too much in charge of strategy. They didn't have enough input. And that war was, of course, a very depressing one for generals, right? That they thought if they had more control, then it would have been a different outcome. And so this last historian here who I quoted, Cohn, right, he kind of made the case that the sort of post-Cold War era, the Bush-Clinton era, was an era where generals were starting to reassert their dominance again, I think is a direct reaction to civilians having too much control during the 1960s and 1970s, right? But yeah, one good example of civilian control is the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would agree. But I think it is because post-MacArthur, presidents feel a lot more confident, right? All right, well, thank you very much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.